Stop the $21 trillion. Ghost. Fleet the US Navy ignored. The call hit at 2 a.m. Admiral, your readiness numbers don't match your fuel receipts. Somewhere in the Pacific, a carrier strike group pushed through black water, air crews strapped in, decks humming. On paper, everything was green. In the ledger, billions of dollars in adjustments propped up the picture. And here's the twist. The ghost fleet isn't ships. It's the phantom ledger deciding which ships live or die. Did procedural accounting failures quietly sabotage US naval supremacy? To find out, we rewind to the 1990s, follow the audit trail through 2 wars, watch software and incentives build a paper ocean, then test it against modern conflict. Rewind, the paper ocean starts filling, 1990s seeds. 3 years after the Cold War ended, the Navy tried to shrink without breaking. The fleet drew down. The missions did not. Logistics still stretched from San Diego to the Persian Gulf. Money still flowed through thousands of accounts. To understand why a 2 a.m. call could rattle an admiral, we need to go back to the 1990s, when the plumbing under the world's most complex military quietly cracked. The stakes felt abstract at first. Spreadsheets, serial numbers, fuel markers. But for real people, supply officers, maintenance chiefs, controllers, every mistyped code meant a late part, a missed inspection, a ship stuck pierside. The Department of Defense promised modernization, then scattered its ledgers across service-unique systems. The Navy clung to legacy platforms, patched with manual workarounds. The new Chief Financial Officers Act demanded auditable books. The reality delivered fractured databases. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Cost-cutting collided with sprawling logistics. Commands were told to do more with less, therefore they learned to certify numbers that wouldn't reconcile. If a quarterly report refused to balance, someone made a temporary entry to push it through, planning to fix it later. Those temporary fixes developed muscle memory. A young supply officer in Norfolk would spend nights copying materiel codes from a green screen terminal into a Lotus spreadsheet, then into a separate maintenance tracker, then into a base-level accounting form. Each hop added the chance for error. Each error needed a plug, and plugging the hole became normal. Here's where it gets real. Imagine ordering a critical pump seal for a guided missile destroyer. The serial number in the maintenance system ends in 73. The inventory control point lists the replacement as 37. The financial system logs both, neither tied to a physical bin. The seal arrives late, or not at all. The destroyer's readiness report shows green because the request exited the queue. The deck plate chief sees red because the pump still leaks. On paper, money moved. In life, steel did not. What nobody knew at the time was how these little shortcuts would scale with war. To prepare for the year 200 bug, teams rushed code changes into brittle systems. Interfaces that barely worked in peacetime started to drift. A base moved to a new general ledger. The ship squadrons feeding it stayed on the old one. Data bridges tried to interpret line items that evolved faster than the translators. When reconciliation failed, unsupported adjustments smoothed the jagged edges. Pass the statement, fix it next quarter. The human moments tell the story. A lieutenant in Pearl Harbor held 2 binders at morning quarters, one with actual receipts, one with the official report. He knew they did not match. He also knew last quarter's variance had already been addressed with a topside adjustment. Push back too hard and your command rating suffers. Your skipper's evaluation takes a hit. Your career narrows. So he circled the gap, sent the email, and certified the status. Meanwhile, across the river in Washington, software contractors pitched enterprise resource planning as salvation. The Navy tried parallel efforts, pilot an ERP in one community, keep legacy in another. But every new module needed translations for thousands of codes born in the 1960s and 1970s. Fix one interface, therefore break 3 downstream reports. The result wasn't fraud, it was friction turned into fiction. When you can't make data agree, you make it agree on paper. This was the moment everything changed, even if it didn't look dramatic. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments, entries lodged to force accounts to balance without adequate documentation, slipped from exception to expectation. If a fuel receipt from a forward depot arrived without a matching fund site, plug it, and move on. If a parts obligation double-posted in two systems, remove one with a journal entry, even if you couldn't trace the original transaction. The intent was housekeeping. The effect was haze. In the shipyards, the haze thickened. Maintenance availabilities depended on itemized work packages tied to budgets tied to ledgers. When an availability grew, discovery work on a corroded seawater system, for example, funding lines got split across fiscal years and commands. One system carried the cost as pending, another as executed, a third as rephased. The carrier looked funded. The invoices lagged. To close the books, someone posted an adjustment. The steel waited. Get this, auditors started raising flags, but the language never reached the pier. Terms like material weakness sounded removed from wrenches and manifolds. Yet those findings meant something simple. The Navy couldn't reliably say what it owned, what it owed, or what it had already spent. Commanders still needed to sail, therefore reports stayed green where they could. The pressure to meet readiness goals was relentless. The habit of forcing balance grew roots. Three things locked the pattern in by the late 1990s. First, leadership turnover. Every 2 or 3 years, new leaders inherited the same brittle systems and the same incentives to report success. Second, mission creep. Peacekeeping, no-fly zones, humanitarian ops, each with unique funding quirks that stressed reconciliation. Third, cultural triage. When the choice is ship the part or fix the ledger, you ship the part and promise to fix the ledger tomorrow. In the aftermath, the paper ocean rose quietly. It didn't look like crisis. It looked like progress reports, dashboards, and certifications that let ships deploy while the back office played catch-up. But the ledgers were becoming a parallel reality. And when the money flood hit, after the year 2001 attacks and the rush to war, those temporary fixes would become the only way to keep the numbers moving. That's when the Phantom fleet began to steer real ships. The software maze, systems that couldn't talk. While the paper ocean rose, the wiring under it frayed. The Navy tried to stitch together modern enterprise resource planning with decades-old accounting tools and service-unique codes that predated the internet. On a screen in a supply office, you'd see 4 windows open: maintenance, finance, inventory, and a homegrown tracker someone's predecessor built in the 1990s. None of them spoke the same language. All of them claimed to be right. Yeah, that's where it gets messy. A maintenance system closed a job when a work center clicked complete, sending a demand signal to inventory. Inventory issued a part and marked the bin down. Finance needed a matching obligation and a receipt coded to the correct fund, appropriation, and fiscal year. But the interface between maintenance and finance relied on translation tables that lagged policy by quarters. A code change at headquarters could take months to filter through. Meanwhile, the ship sailed. Fixing one module often broke 3 reports downstream. An update that made maintenance screens faster suddenly produced duplicate line items in the inventory ledger. The interface didn't know which transaction was authoritative, so it posted both. Finance pulled the feed, found totals out of balance, and did the one thing that guaranteed tomorrow's conv would sail. It inserted a plug to force balance. On the books, this lived as an unsupported journal voucher adjustment, an entry made to reconcile accounts without adequate supporting documentation. Now remember the tempo after the year 2001 attacks. 2 wars, urgent buys, new vendors, contingency accounts that lived outside peacetime norms. Interfaces that looked stable in testing buckled under the load. A clerk at a forward detachment keyed receipts into a theater system that didn't map cleanly to the Navy's enterprise resource planning. Back at the home station, the bill arrived stripped of the fields the general ledger needed. The result wasn't theft. It was a broken conversation between machines, patched by humans with deadline pressure and incomplete data. Get this, every system carried its own date logic, fund life rules, and status codes. Maintenance said awaiting parts, inventory said issued, finance said unliquidated obligation, and the dashboard still turned green because one of the 4 boxes flipped to complete. When auditors traced the chain, they found gaps where the handoff should have been. A command would swear the part arrived. The warehouse would swear it left. The money would show movement without a clean trail tying dollars to a serial number in a specific bin. What nobody knew at the time was how many of these handoffs depended on people retyping from printouts. In a back office in Mayport, a petty officer read a dot matrix listing and keyed the numbers into a finance form because the interface script failed overnight. He finished the queue. He met the suspense. He also introduced a dozen transposed digits that would haunt reconciliation for a year. To close the quarter, a supervisor approved journal vouchers to true up the mismatched totals. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments climbed, not because anyone planned it, but because the plumbing leaked and the mission could not wait. Meanwhile, software teams sprinted. They patched application programming interfaces, wrote new translators, and pushed hotfixes that made today's report look sane. But the codes at the heart of the Navy's world, work center identifiers, material control numbers, appropriation symbols, were the product of layered eras. The 1970s met the 1990s, met the 2010s inside a single screen. You could fix the display and still have a hidden field carrying an obsolete value that triggered a phantom obligation 3 steps later. This was the moment everything changed in a subtle way. The ledger started telling commanders what they wanted to hear, not out of malice, but out of misalignment. A carrier air wing looked fully mission capable because the maintenance closeouts flowed faster than the receipts. A destroyer's fuel line showed healthy because the Enterprise resource planning rolled forward prior period balances when a port fuel receipt posted without the right fund site. "We'll reconcile next month," became the quiet chorus. Next month turned into next year. Auditors wrote it down in restrained language. Material weaknesses, lack of sufficient audit trail, inability to substantiate balances. On the pier, sailors translated that into late parts, surprise shortfalls, and Friday emails begging for screenshots to satisfy a control checklist. The habit set in: move the operation, fix the paperwork later. To make a report whole, you used a journal voucher. When the voucher lacked a clean chain back to source documents, it landed in the bucket everyone now recognizes: unsupported journal voucher adjustments. Meanwhile, across town, a different fix created a new crack. A performance tweak stopped duplicate postings, but it also stopped error flags from firing when an obligation lacked a receipt. The errors didn't go away, they went quiet. Quarter end arrived. The numbers did not match. So the team posted a balancing entry to close the books on time. The ship sailed. The ledger lied. Then the money flood hit with urgency purchases and split funding lines, and the software maze hardened. The Navy had built a world where the data bridges carried more traffic than the roads, and every detour ended with someone forced to choose: delay a mission or manufacture a clean number. Over and over, the choice was the mission. The costs would surface later as a ghost fleet made of numbers that never quite tied back to steel. Wartime velocity: Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Audit cliff, 2000s. 3 days after the first airstrikes, the purchase orders started stacking like sandbags. Urgent, 24-hour turns, shipped to theater with no time for the usual choreography. The mission didn't pause for ledgers. It sprinted past them. The Navy's supply chain shifted from peacetime cadence to combat velocity, and every brittle seam in the plumbing we just walked through began to split under load. Here's the stakes plain. When you're fighting 2 land wars and sustaining carrier operations, delays aren't paperwork problems. They're broken sorties, missed intercepts, and crews waiting on a part that the system swears already shipped. In the 2000s, contingency contracting became the rule. Theater-level systems logged receipts in deserts far from shipyards. Split funding lines tried to marry overseas operations with home station accounts that lived by different rules. And speed, always speed, overrode the ritual of matching every dollar to every document. Action flooded the decks. Contracting officers took satellite calls from tents, greenlit buys from vendors no one had worked with before, and prayed the chain would catch up later. At a warehouse in Bahrain, a petty officer scanned pallets at midnight using a handheld that didn't map cleanly to the Navy's Enterprise ledger. The serial numbers posted to a theater database. Back in Norfolk, the obligation showed up as a lump sum flagged, insufficient detail. The strike group turned the wrenches anyway. On paper, a journal entry would later smooth the gap. Meanwhile, field receipts came in waves. Someone keyed, received, to clear a back-ordered valve and get a helicopter back up. The part actually landed 2 days later, but the dashboard had already rolled to green. Finance pulled reports that couldn't find a valid fund cite on half the theater obligations. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments began to spike as units force-closed accounts without the paperwork trail auditors needed. The intent wasn't to hide anything. It was to move, to sail, to fly. Here's where it gets crazy for the humans inside it. A lieutenant at an expeditionary support unit opened 5 systems to chase a single engine component. Maintenance said complete. Inventory said issued. Theater said in transit. Finance said unmatched. The ship at sea said, "We're down one." He called 3 time zones to line up a duplicate buy, knowing one of them would become an orphaned obligation the books would have to reconcile later. He also knew his commander expected a green brief at 80. He made the call. The plane flew. The ledger braced for an adjustment. What nobody knew at the time was how long this rhythm would last. Months became years. The temporary theater workarounds hardened into practice. Split funding became standard. Unliquidated obligations piled up because the last link, clean, audited receipt documentation, lagged by quarters. In a world where every hour mattered, the phrase, supporting documentation, sounded like a peacetime luxury. So quarter-ins arrived, and commands did what they'd learned in the 1990s. They posted plugs to close the books. Auditors later wrote the story in calm prose. Material weaknesses, inadequate support for balances, inability to substantiate transactions across systems. But on the ground, it looked like sailors rekeying serials from a fax because a digital bridge went down. It looked like a contracting officer accepting a delivery at dusk with a signature on a clipboard, only to discover weeks later that the scanned copy never reached the Enterprise repository. By then, the operation had moved on, the unit had rotated home, and a controller had a deadline. Now remember the scale. Billions in obligations flowed through accounts built for steady-state operations. Every miscoded entry spawned a phantom twin or a dangling debit. Each demanded a fix. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments became the broom that swept the hangar after the sortie. The number grew, not as cash vanishing, but as the visible scar tissue of a control system outrun by a war's tempo. Meanwhile, a new pressure joined the chaos: performance metrics. Commanders needed mission-capable rates that signaled confidence to higher headquarters. The only worse sin than a broken plane was a red slide. When maintenance closed work orders to reflect actual fixes, the financial reconciliation often lagged. The reporting tools didn't wait. They rolled up whatever data arrived first. Green boxes multiplied even as the paper trail fell behind. Fix the fight now, fix the ledger tomorrow. Tomorrow kept missing. Then came the audit cliff. After years of crisis, tempo, Congress and inspectors general pushed harder on the promise of auditable books. Teams fanned out. They traced samples from statement to source. They found gaps you could drive a convoy through. A fuel receipt posted at a forward port with no matching funds site back home. A parts obligation recorded twice in different systems with no clean way to prove which one reflected steel in a bin. The response wasn't denial, it was exhaustion. Commands promised remediation plans. Software teams wrote bridge code. Units kept flying and sailing. In the aftermath of surge operations, the reckoning felt uneven. Some commands cleaned chains end to end. Others leaned on old habits and fresh justifications. The mission could not wait. But one thing crystallized: the Navy's books weren't built to survive a decade of emergency workarounds. The unsupported adjustments weren't a headline to argue on cable news. They were a signal that the tools guiding real decisions, readiness rates, inventory counts, cost baselines, were fogged. Speed demanded success, therefore oversight blinked. And when the tempo finally eased, the accumulated haze didn't clear on its own. It had to be burned off, line by line, voucher by voucher, in audits that would force leaders to pick between 2 uncomfortable truths: admit the numbers were cleaner than reality, or accept that reality had outpaced the numbers. That choice, the $21 trillion number, what it is and what it is not. Here's where the headline warps the truth. The $21 trillion figure is not a vault of missing cash. It's a signal, a blaring alarm, built from something dry and technical that quietly shapes real-world power, unsupported journal voucher adjustments. Think of a journal voucher as the accountant's wrench. You use it to correct or move entries so the books reflect reality. But when that wrench gets used without the proper blueprint, without invoices, receipts, or a clean audit trail, it becomes an unsupported adjustment. The number balances. The reality doesn't. To understand why this matters, we need one more layer. In the Navy's world, every dollar traces to a purpose: fuel, parts, maintenance, training. The chain should run from a commander's requirement to a contract, to an obligation, to a receipt, to a paid invoice, tied to a specific fund and fiscal year. When a link is missing, because a system didn't pass a field, a receipt didn't upload, or two ledgers disagreed, someone posts a journal voucher to reconcile the account. If the backup isn't there, it lands in the bucket auditors call unsupported. Those entries add up. Over years, they tell a story about control, not theft. Now about the scale. Economist Dr. Mark Skidmore went line by line through public reports, audits, Office of Inspector General findings, and financial statements, covering the year 1998 through the year 2015 for the Department of Defense and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He tallied roughly $21 trillion in unsupported adjustments reported across those years. Not money siphoned away, not pallets of cash. Adjustments, paper moves, filed without sufficient documentation to pass an audit standard. Dry words, massive stakes. Why massive? Because those adjustments are like fog on the windshield. Leaders make decisions off dashboards that roll these numbers up. If inventory looks full on paper, but the path back to a serial numbered item in a specific bin is cloudy, you can't swear that missile exists where the plan says it does. If a fuel account closes with a plug because a port receipt didn't map, your cost baseline for steaming days can drift. Over a carrier's deployment cycle, that drift can hide the true burn rate that decides whether the next ship sails on time. Auditors have been blunt in calm language. They flag material weaknesses. The systems can't substantiate balances. The chain from statement to source breaks. Reconciliations rely on manual workarounds that leave no durable trail. Inside those findings lives the human problem we've been following. Commands under pressure to brief green, software that lags policy, and a culture trained to fix the fight first and the ledger later. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments are the visible scar tissue from that choice. Here's where it hits the pier. A submarine squadron plans maintenance windows based on historical costs and parts consumption. If prior year ledgers were force balanced with unsupported entries, the trend line lies. You budget tight. Discovery work explodes. Availabilities slip. Then the cascade. Crews extend, training compresses, and the next deployment window squeezes into an already thin calendar. On a map, it looks like a scheduling issue. In life, it's a missing receipt that triggered a balancing entry 5 years ago. What nobody knew at the time those entries were posted was how they'd warp readiness. When an enterprise system rolls forward a prior period balance that rested on an unsupported voucher, the illusion compounds. A destroyer's fuel account looks fine because the deficit was papered over last quarter. A munitions stockpile looks healthy because the counts reconcile to a number, not to serialized items you can put your hand on. The plan assumes steel that isn't there yet. Dr. Mark Skidmore's compilation forced a public reckoning. It didn't prove theft, it proved opacity. It said, in effect, the largest enterprise in the world can't show its work at scale. For sailors, that translates to late parts and uncertain timelines. For commanders, it means a green box that might be read the first time you open the casing. For adversaries reading open source signals, it suggests a gap between what the United States says it can surge and what it can actually move. And here's the knife twist. In a peacetime briefing, the difference is an annoyance. In a crisis, it's the lag that lets an opponent act while you wait for a clean picture. If you can't trace the dollar, you can't trust the schedule. If you can't trust the schedule, you can't promise presence on a date certain. And deterrence, the quiet math that prevents wars, leans hard on promises kept. So no, the $21 trillion isn't a pile of vanished funds. It's a yardstick of fragility. It measures decades where the ledger became a stage prop instead of a map. And every unsupported voucher inside that total is a reminder. When numbers stop tying back to bolts, O-rings, and bunker fuel, the fleet you think you have starts to drift into myth. Numbers are symptoms. Incentives are the disease. Now we have to talk about why people kept those dashboards green. Incentives, career risk, check-the-box culture. The numbers didn't break in a vacuum. People bent them because the system bent them first. Inside a command suite, the screen glowed with stoplight colors. Green for mission capable, amber for at risk, red for fail. Those colors weren't just updates. They were career signals. A red box could end a command tour early. An amber could drag an officer's evaluation down a notch. Green meant survive to fight another board. When unsupported journal voucher adjustments smoothed rough edges, they also smoothed risk for someone. Here's the grind. A department head knew the engine room was cannibalizing parts to keep sortie rates up. He also knew the enterprise dashboard rolled those completions into bright green tiles. He faced a choice every leader quietly understands: report the amber and invite inspections, or certify green and promise to clean the ledger next week. Meanwhile, the schedule burned forward. The choice kept landing on green. 3 days earlier, a controller briefed the skipper. We can't prove the fuel spent at rotor to an audit standard. The receipt fields didn't map. The skipper asked one question: does that stop the ship from sailing? The answer was no. Therefore, the ledger fix moved to after action. A junior analyst drafted a remediation plan, new control, new checklist, new training, filed it, and watched it disappear into a portal. The ship sailed on time. The unsupported entry lived on the books. What nobody knew at the time was how the incentives compounded across echelons. A task force commander needed to report readiness to higher headquarters by Friday noon. Subordinate units sent their snapshots Wednesday, still reconciling invoices from a hectic port call. Some numbers were soft. The staff massaged the trend line. We're trending green with minor risk. The phrasing mattered. A minor risk didn't trigger a stand down. It bought time. It also taught everyone on the chain that smoothing truths was safer than flashing red. Get this, auditors weren't the villains here. They flagged gaps and offered fixes, but the fix often clashed with operations. A clean audit trail wants serial-level documentation, standardized coding, and receipts uploaded within tight windows. A fleet moving fast wants the part outbound yesterday. When the two collided, commands wrote exception justifications and shoved them into shared drives. Those justifications counted as effort. Effort counted as progress. Progress kept evaluations glowing. Meanwhile, a different pressure built: budget cycles. Leaders fought to protect share. If your books showed chronic shortfalls, headquarters might raid your lines to plug another crisis. If your numbers looked efficient, you might survive the next rephasing drill. So staff officers learned an unspoken rule: do not show red without a solution attached. If the solution required a journal voucher to make this quarter look sane, the voucher went in. The promise to fix root cause slid to the next timeline. Here's a human moment. A chief petty officer sat with a young supply clerk at 9 p.m., teaching her which code would clear the suspense account before midnight. Use this one, he said, not because it was perfect, but because it would pass the nightly batch run and let the maintenance closeout post. He wasn't gaming the system. He was getting jets ready for dawn. He also knew that every delay he prevented pushed the truth one step further from the ledger. Whistleblowers felt the edge of this culture. Raise a hand too loudly, and your inbox filled with helpful reminders about teamwork and timing. We'll fix it in the remediation sprint, became the stock reply. Problem solved on paper equals problem deferred in life. A few kept pushing, documenting mismatches, logging missing receipts, refusing to certify what they couldn't trace. Some paid for it with stalled careers, frost in FITREPs, isolation at meetings where everyone else nodded along to green slides. Meanwhile, promotions favored the language of success. Officers fluent in dashboards and outcomes advanced. Those who insisted on slow, painful reconciliation found themselves labeled as not ready for the next level. The message traveled fast. Protect the metric, therefore protect yourself. and every protected metric became a little looser with reality. This was the moment everything changed in quiet ways. The system rewarded certification over verification. It taught people to conflate effort with evidence, plans with performance. Unsupported journal voucher adjustments weren't just accounting artifacts. They were the residue of survival instincts. When your livelihood depends on a green box, you'll do almost anything the rules allow to keep it green. But incentives cut both ways. Tie promotions to audit outcomes, real ones, and behavior shifts. Shield truth-tellers and reports start matching decks. Until that happens, the paper ocean stays calm while the steel underneath strains. The culture didn't wake up one day and choose fiction. It drifted there, slide by slide, quarter by quarter, because green meant safety and red meant pain. The maintenance Mirage, ships that are ready on paper. While those incentives hardened, steel started telling a different story. A cruiser's dashboard glowed green. On the pier, sailors held a scavenged valve like a trophy because the real one was in process for 6 weeks. Paper said mission capable. The engine room said, we're one leak from shutdown. Here are the stakes without jargon. If maintenance slips, combat power collapses on a calendar you did not plan. Carriers miss flight deck certifications. Submarines sit bow up in dry dock while crews drift to other boats. Strike groups that are supposed to rotate like clockwork begin to lurch. By the time a commander sees it, the schedule is already lying. Action moved in small, desperate fixes. A destroyer pulled into Yokosuka for a 3-day fuel and food turn. At 2 a.m., the engineering chief signed off a work order because the interface needed the closeout before dawn to keep the mission-capable rate above the line briefed to higher headquarters. The part, shipped. Reality. A tech down in supply had marked issued to clear a suspense, then called a sister ship across the pier to borrow the actual component. Cannibalization was not policy, it was survival. The ledger logged a completion. The swap never touched a journal. Meanwhile, depot-level work kept slipping to the right. Discovery on corroded seawater piping added weeks. Vendors short on skilled welders added months. The availability plan said execute. The yard said stand by. Planners adjusted Gantt charts to fit a world their numbers did not describe. A carrier's propulsion work crept into the window where air wing training should have ramped up. The green slide at the flag brief held. The red phone calls multiplied. What nobody knew at the time was how the Mirage compounded. A parts requisition closed in maintenance triggered a green cell the operations officer needed for his weekly report. Finance still waited on a receipt that never posted. Inventory showed a bin at 0 with a pending backfill. 3 truths, 1 color. Quarter end arrived. Someone balanced the cost center with a voucher. Unsupported at the document level, clean at the dashboard level. The next quarter inherited the illusion. Get this, dry dock math turned brutal. Submarines do not tolerate wishful thinking. If a bearing arrives late, the whole sequence slides. You cannot compress hydrostatic testing into a talking point, yet schedules tried. A boat was declared approaching red in a tracker, then mitigated when the vendor promised a ship date. The promise drifted. The tracker stayed green. Crew families sold leases. Junior sailors prepped for sea. The boat did not move. Year 2024 and year 2025, NAVPLAN signals tried to cut through the spin. They flagged multiple readiness metrics at red and amber, warned that shipyard capacity and workforce shortfalls were hard limits, and made plain that demand outstripped the system's ability to deliver. Inside commands, that candor met the old reflex, find a path to yes, mitigate with overtime, pull artisans from another hull, phase the work into the next availability. Each mitigation bought a week and sold a month downrange. Human moments fixed the real ledger. A machinist's mate on night shift pulled a pump apart and found a hairline crack the inspection missed. He logged it, then watched the work order bounce between codes because the template did not fit the find. He walked the part to the planner. The planner called the vendor. The vendor said 6 weeks. The sailor said, we deploy in 4. Across the base, another team stripped their spare and drove it over in a pickup. The destroyer sailed. The next ship in line inherited the whole. Meanwhile, certifications slipped in ways that did not make slides. A strike group commander accepted waivers to keep the timeline. We'll complete event Bravo at sea. The letter looked clean. The sea did not care. Weather closed the window. The event moved again. By the end of the workup, the crew had more paper risk accepted than time on task. The readiness report held green. The crew felt amber. Fuel and parts fed the Mirage too. A tanker missed its berth window. The port receipt lagged. The ship's burn rate calculation used the last clean number and a model that assumed steady seas and steady ops. The model lied by inches every day. Over a month, the error became a day late to station. The brief still showed arrival on time because the Enterprise system rolled forward balances smoothed by prior plugs. "We'll reconcile on return," became the quiet default. Auditors kept writing it in calm prose. Planned versus actual availability gaps persist. Controls insufficient to prevent or detect misstatements. Reliance on manual workarounds. Translated to deck plates. Your plan is optimistic. Your tools are blind. Your people are compensating. And every compensation hid the size of the hole. This was the moment everything changed for the sailors who had to live inside both worlds. They learned to carry two truths. The one they certified and the one they fixed at 2 a.m. green on the screen meant we found a way. It did not mean we are ready. Paper readiness met pier-side reality, therefore combat timelines stretched. And in the spaces between those timelines, rivals studied the gaps. The yard bottleneck, industrial base versus phantom planning. While sailors fought the Mirage on the pier, the real choke point sat behind the gate at the yards. Limited dry dock slots, crews stretched thin, vendors short on welders and electricians. The planning slide said execute. The dock said, wait your turn. That gap didn't just steal weeks. It rewired the whole calendar of combat power. Here are the stakes in plain sight. If you cannot get steel into a dock with the right artisans on the right day, you cannot meet the next deployment window. A carrier that misses propulsion work by 2 months pushes its air wing into bad weather for certifications. A submarine stuck on blocks wipes an entire patrol cycle off the board. The fleet schedule starts looking like a wish list. Action looked like triage disguised as optimism. A destroyer arrived for a 6-week availability. Day 3, the inspectors opened a sea chest and found corrosion spidering out of a weld. Scope growth hit like a wave. The planner added tasks to the package. The vendor managing that line shook his head. His certified welders were already burning overtime on a cruiser across the basin. "We can shift 2 in next Friday," he said. Friday turned into the following Wednesday. The Gantt chart flexed. The cost estimate crept up. The ledger carried pending in one system, executed in another, and rephased in a third. To close the month, someone posted a catch-up adjustment. The steel waited. Meanwhile, discovery work ballooned in ways the budget never captured. A bolt that should have turned sheared, revealing a sleeve that had to be remachined. The shop with the tooling had a backlog from 3 ships and an emergency job for a submarine. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. The work package grew. The funds did not. Staff raided training lines and spares, accounts to feed the yard. The bill landed on other ships that now had to stretch old parts a little longer. Get this, in NAVPLAN year 2024 and year 2025, warnings put numbers to what crews already knew. Workforce shortfalls were hard limits, not variables to massage. Without new capacity, critical platforms would sit in red availability bands. Inside the yards, bosses kept taking calls from program managers asking for miracles. Can you pull artisans from the amphib to finish the destroyer? If I do, the amphib slips, came the answer. Every solution bought a day today and sold a week tomorrow. What nobody knew at the time was how much phantom planning had crept into the baseline. Early estimates assumed best-case discovery. Vendor bids leaned toward optimism to win awards. Government cost codes didn't map neatly to the way real work unraveled in pits and tanks. The result was a paper plan that assumed clean handoffs and minimal surprises, slammed into an industrial reality built on older facilities, aging tooling, and a national shortage of specialized labor. When the two collided, the plan lost. Human moments carried the weight. A yard foreman stared at a whiteboard with 5 ships listed and a handful of names circled in red, his only level 3 weld inspectors. He shuffled them like chess pieces, trying to avoid idle crews on one side of the yard while critical jobs on the other side starved for sign-offs. A program manager up the chain stared at a dashboard that showed on track because the last update captured a partial milestone. He briefed Green. The foreman stayed late. Meanwhile, supply chain fragility turned single parts into pacing items. A valve body cast from a foundry in a single Midwestern town had a flaw. The lot was rejected. The next batch was 8 weeks out. 8 weeks to put the sub beyond its dry dock slot. The dock master offered a 3-day slip window. Miss it, and the whole rotation reshuffled. The decision landed in a conference call. Do we rush ship an unproven alternative and risk rework? Or do we blow the schedule and tell higher headquarters the red box is real? The choice cut both ways. Either way, a metric somewhere got protected. Auditors later called it out with calm lines. Scope growth mid-availability, insufficient man-hour estimation, cost codes misaligned to actual work performed. Translated, your plan undercounts the pain, and your books cannot see the truth until it is too late. So, catch up. Adjustments spiked at quarter ends as teams tried to align financial snapshots to a reality that no longer fit the bid. Then the ripple hit the fleet. A carrier availability bled into the month. An amphib group needed the same dock. The amphibs slid right. The Marines trained on simulators waiting for steel. A destroyer slated to escort them extended on station to cover the gap. Crews went past comfort into burnout. Families reset calendars again. The ledger rolled forward balances with neat columns. The map filled with holes. NAVPLAN's red and amber bands were not fingerwags, they were flares. They said out loud, capacity is the constraint. Workforce is the constraint. If you do not add docks, train artisans, and buy realistic schedules with real money, no amount of clever briefing will change when ships leave the pier. Underestimate now, therefore pay triple later. The yard bosses knew it. The sailors lived it. The only question left was whether the ledger would finally tell the truth before the next crisis. Munitions demanded it, and the vanishing inventory. While docks and welders bent timelines, the quiet cliff waited in tanks and magazines. Fuel and munitions are the bloodstream and the fists. If either is fuzzy on the ledger, every plan you brief has a hidden asterisk. On screens, fuel accounts looked stable and magazines looked healthy. On the pier, chiefs kept separate notebooks because the enterprise view felt a step behind reality. Here are the stakes in plain terms. Without bunker fuel and precision weapons, a carrier strike group is a loud, expensive target. Surge plans assume tankers hit their marks and missiles sit on racks in the right numbers, with the right shelf life, at the right bases. If the receipts and the serials do not match what the slide says, you do not own the timing. The timing owns you. Action started small. A destroyer pulled into a forward port for a tight refuel. The pier schedule slipped by 6 hours when a civilian tanker missed its window. The receipt posted late and hit the system with half the fields populated. Finance could not tie the gallons to the correct fund site fast enough to update the burn model. Operations used the last good number and a steady state curve. Seas were rough. Ops tempo was high. The model lied by a few percentage points. Over a week, that lie became a day off station. The logbook told the truth. The dashboard caught up later. Meanwhile, munitions math turned brutal. Smart weapons live by serials and shelf lives. A pallet of missiles looked full to a head count, but 3 lots were within weeks of expiration. Extensions required inspections, forms, and a qualified sign-off. The inspection team was at another magazine, validating a different lot for a different exercise. The spreadsheet said green. The cage chief said, "We can't shoot those past Friday." He logged the risk. The enterprise system did not reflect it until the update batch ran days later. Get this, the interfaces that carried serialized munitions data to finance were never built for crisis tempo. A lot accepted at a depot flowed to an inventory system with its own codes. The financial ledger wanted value by appropriation and fiscal year, not line-by-line serials. To make the books square, someone rolled values up, then back down with allocation keys that worked on paper but did not tell a captain which tail number sat in which bay. When auditors chased the thread, they could prove dollars moved. They could not always prove that movement reconciled to a specific weapon in a specific locker on a specific ship. Now remember the culture from earlier. Under pressure, people closed gaps to keep green slides. A magazine officer, facing an inspection, found that 2 systems disagreed on counts by 5 rounds. He ran a quick recount. The handheld scanner timed out. He keyed numbers manually. The fix cleared the alert. Weeks later, a replenishment ship requested those tail numbers for a loadout. The numbers existed in the ledger, but the physical items had been cross-leveled to another pier during a night move after a broken forklift jammed a bay door. The paper trailed the steel. Year 2024 and year 2025, NAVPLAN warnings tried to cut through the fog. They called out depleted magazines and constrained fuel logistics in sober lines. They said, essentially, the demand signal outpaces the resupply machine and the machine's visibility is patchy. Inside ready rooms that translated to caveats during briefs. Loadouts are green, pending validation. Pending became the most dangerous word in the building. Human moments filled the gap. An ordnance tech sat with a grease pencil marking expiration dates on canisters because the printouts lagged. He flagged 3 lots for urgent inspection. The team arrived a day late, cleared 2, condemned 1. The condemned lot stayed in the system as serviceable until the overnight sync. A squadron planner, building a strike plan, saw green bars. He also knew the tech's voice. He cut the plan by a sortie and called the ship. The ship called the replenishment oiler. The oiler shifted pallets at sea in heavy weather. The mission flew. The ledger smiled tomorrow. Fuel ran the same loops. A theater tanker schedule slipped, so a strike group begged an alternate with fewer hoses and a slower pump rate. The math worked if the seas cooperated. The seas did not. A second refuel event bled into an air wings training window. The training slid. A week later, a flag officer asked why. The answer traced back to a late receipt, a partial data post, and a model that smoothed the error with last quarter's plug. Unsupported at the document level, persuasive at the briefing level. What nobody knew at the time was how often available meant exist somewhere in the system, not here, not now. A base commander signed a status report that counted missiles in a shared pool as if they were on his pier. The pool lived across 3 sites and 2 services. A surge order hit. Trucks rolled to the wrong fence line because the shipping code referenced an old routing. The fix happened by phone, by favor, by people who knew names, not fields. Auditors kept writing it plainly. Reconciliations miss fuel receipts. Bulk orders lack serial-level tracking. Reliance on manual workarounds. Insufficient evidence to substantiate balances. Translated for war plans. You might not have what you think you have when you need it. The remedy was simple and hard. Serialized munitions tracking that lives in one truth. Fuel reconciliation that clears in hours, not weeks. Until then, inventory opacity feeds false confidence at scale. And somewhere offshore, a captain nods at a green slide, then turns to the chief who keeps the real book and asks, "Do we truly have it?" Microcase, a destroyer's ghost parts. To see how the fog turns into friction, follow one hull. A flight IIA destroyer, weeks from joining a carrier strike group, sat at the pier with a punch list that looked routine, a fuel pump cartridge, a mission computer card, and a heat exchanger sleeve. The dashboard showed green. The crew felt the clock. Here are the stakes, tight and personal. If those 3 items don't land in time, certifications slide. If certifications slide, the strike group reshuffles, escorts stretch patrols, and the whole calendar buckles. A ship is either where it promised to be or it is. There's no partial credit at sea. Action started with a familiar dance. The engineering department saw the pump trending hot, opened a maintenance action, and flagged the cartridge as high priority. The maintenance system kicked a demand to inventory. Inventory showed 2 on hand in theater, 1 ashore, 1 afloat. Finance showed funds obligated, receipt pending. Operations saw the green tile and moved to the next risk. The engineering chief did not trust the tile. He walked to supply. Supply cracked open 5 screens. Maintenance, requisition closed as issued. Inventory, issued to unit, bin 0, theater tracker, in transit, awaiting transload. Financial ledger, unliquidated obligation, enterprise dashboard. On hand, 4 truths, 1 promised. He called the phone number in the theater note. The number was stale. Meanwhile, the mission computer card lived in a parallel maze. The ship's tech had cannibalized a card last underway to keep a radar alive. He filed the paperwork. The replacement showed available at a stateside warehouse. The warehouse, working a backlog, had cross-leveled that card to another destroyer after a night phone call. The ledger missed the favor. On paper, the card existed in 2 places. In steel, it sat in one rack 1,000 miles away. Get this, timelines compress fast when one part drifts. The heat exchanger sleeve was low drama until the pump delay turned it into a pacing item. The vendor's delivery date slid by 3 days, then 5, then unknown, awaiting machining slot. The planner updated the package. The availability window narrowed. The destroyer's captain called the Strike Group C combat commander and said the quiet part, "We're tight." What nobody knew at the time was that the pump cartridge had hung on a pallet in a regional hub because the shipping code still pointed to the destroyer's old home port. A clerk saw the mismatch, held it for clarification, and sent an email into a shared inbox that filtered by a rule nobody checked daily. The pump was 20 miles away for 48 hours. The ledger never blinked. Human moments closed the gap. A chief bosun's mate knew a civilian driver who made base runs. He called a favor. The driver found the pallet, rolled it to the right gate, and waited out a bad barcode. The engineering chief signed with a pen because the handheld scanner crashed. The part came aboard. The maintenance screen turned green for the reason that should always count: hands on metal. The mission computer card was uglier. The supply officer started dialing. He reached the other destroyer's supply shop, confirmed the cross-level, and asked for a reversal. The other ship had flown on the card's success and could not give it back. So the supply officer went hunting upstream. He found a second card available in the enterprise system. It lived at a depot that required a different approval chain and a fund site that had expired last week. He called the controller. The controller called the type commander. A one-time exception moved by dinner. The card shipped overnight. It arrived with a packing slip that misprinted the serial by 2 digits, which would have kicked the receipt out of the financial system. The storekeeper hand-corrected the slip and walked it to the office that scanned documents. The scanner jammed. He rescanned and watched the green bar crawl. Impact rippled fast. The strike group had penciled in a reshuffle. Another destroyer would swap stations if the pump missed. Overtime surged on the pier as crews worked through a weekend to hold the cert window. A waiver request sat drafted, ready to accept a training event at sea if the mission card landed Tuesday instead of Monday. When the parts finally cleared, the destroyer made its slot by hours, not days. Here's the lesson in one breath. The ledger said yes, therefore the pier said no, until people forced them to agree. Multiply that by every ship with available parts that exist only on paper, and you see the fleet's heartbeat skip. The destroyer sailed with a logbook full of favors and fixes. The dashboard looked perfect. The crew knew how close it came to becoming the next ghost story. Adversaries read the ledger. Timing, deception, pressure. While the destroyer fought ghosts on the pier, someone else read the same tea leaves, only they read them as opportunity. Rivals don't need spies in every yard when public signals and predictable rhythms tell a story. If you can guess when the dock lights go on and the strike group's green slides depend on waivers, you can plan pressure with a calendar. Here are the stakes in one line. If adversaries sense maintenance chaos, they probe seams, not steel. They aren't trying to outgun a carrier on day 1. They're trying to outweight it on day -7. Intelligence services scrape open reports, track ship movements, parse speeches, and notice which hull numbers keep missing photos on deployment day. When a carrier's propulsion availability slips, grey zone actions appear right at the edge of its projected return. Action looked subtle at first. A rival Coast Guard staged fishing inspections along a disputed line during a window when the nearest US destroyers sat in compressed training cycles. A militia flotilla harassed a tanker route the week a replenishment oiler was down for a hard-to-source part. A maritime militia pushed into shoals just as an amphib group's escort swapped in a ship fresh from yard trials. None of it required a war order. It required timing. Get this, adversaries can build models as easily as staff officers. They watch transit times from home ports. They correlate port calls with dry dock bookings and contractor announcements. They note when strike training events slip into to be conducted at sea, and guess that sea states will erase half of them. Then they pressure test a commitment, force a response that burns fuel, pulls munitions forward, and eats the thin margin a commander hoped to hide. Meanwhile, everything we've walked through, the unsupported adjustments, the green dashboard smoothing red realities, leaks into their calculus. If they see a fleet briefing green, while NAVPLAN year 2024 and year 2025 warnings point to red and amber, they assume the slide deck is negotiating with physics. So they synchronize. An island build-up here during a carrier workup there. A ballistic missile test the week, a submarine tender goes cold iron. The moves feel unconnected. The calendar says otherwise. Human stories prove it on the water. An Allied planner in Singapore built an exercise around 2 American destroyers. 10 days out, one ship asked to shorten events because a last-minute parts swap stole crew rest. The ally adjusted. 2 days later, a rival Coast Guard surged cutters into nearby lanes and accidentally anchored on a cable. The Americans flexed to cover, burning fuel and flight hours they'd budgeted tight. The exercise shrank to a seminar. The message traveled, your plans are soft. What nobody knew at the time was how much of this queuing came from open sources the US itself released. Press notes about shipyard milestones, public calendars for certifications, even hometown features when sailors returned late from sea. Adversaries didn't need secrets, they needed patterns. And the patterns were painted in bright tones by a culture that preferred green slides over frank gaps. Now remember the destroyer's near miss with the pump and card. Scale that risk to a strike group scheduled to relieve another in a strait. If the arriving group shows 24 hours late, the transiting group loiters, stretching a maintenance clock already on edge. Rivals nudge. Harassment flights increase. A drone swarm lingers near refueling tracks. Nothing crosses the line, but everything pushes toward fatigue. The choice set narrows to bad and worse. Get this, pressure isn't always ships. Cyber teams hit port logistics software the night before replenishment. A glitch delays a crane rotation, which holds a pallet, which slips a loadout, which burns a window the air wing counted on. On the ledger, the costs appear as overtime and catch-up adjustments. At sea, it's one less sortie on launch day. The adversary reads the outcomes, not the accrual codes. Allied confidence lives in these margins. Partners plan around promises. You'll be here on this date with this kit. When the date moves, even for good reasons, uncertainty spreads. A regional navy cancels its patrol extension because it can't carry your gap again. A minister fields questions in Parliament about leaning too hard on an American presence that keeps slipping to the right. Deterrence erodes by inches, then by feet. NAVPLAN's red and amber risk bands were meant to stiffen backs, embrace the red, declare the constraint. Adversaries embraced it too. They mapped those bands onto their opportunity charts. When the public plan says capacity is short and workforce is thin, they don't need to guess which weeks to apply heat. They can see the stress points and shape their calendar to ours. Human moments close the loop. A captain stood on a bridge wing at dusk, watching lights on the horizon that weren't there last week. His radio chirped with another routine hail that dragged a conversation long enough to force a fuel calc redo. He glanced at the ops officer's board. The board was tight. He knew the next oiler was late by hours. He also knew the briefing slide up the chain still showed green. He whispered to the chief, "We'll make it." He hated the math. Predictable gaps invite opportunistic escalation. That doesn't mean tomorrow's war. It means today's pressure, time to our yards, our parts, our ledgers. If the Enterprise keeps smoothing red to green, adversaries will keep writing calendars in our blind spots. The real ghosts, mothballs, rotations, and off-book illusions. Scale the destroyer's near miss to a fleet that counts hulls it can't actually sail on time. The real ghosts aren't phantoms at sea. They're ships in press releases, slides, and backup plans that look ready until a wrench touches steel. Counting hulls isn't counting power. Counting days to reliable sortie is. Here are the stakes, blunt and human. A president makes a promise based on numbers that include reserve capacity, surge lift, and reactivation timelines. A crisis hits. Staff opens the binder labeled contingency. Inside are ships, crews, and cargo plans that exist on paper. The clock does not care about paper. It cares about hours, artisans, and mariners who know how to light off engines older than most of the crew. Action lives where logistics meets nostalgia. The Ready Reserve Force, the emergency sealift fleet, still includes steam-powered roll-on, roll-off vessels dating back to the 1970s. That's roughly 50 years of age on platforms that require dwindling mariner skill sets and scarce parts. In a sea trial, one of those steamships passes pier checks, then stalls on a valve nobody has in stock. A chief engineer who learned on diesels stares at a schematic for a plant he's only seen in training slides. The crew calls for a consultant who retired 15 years ago. The clock keeps running. Meanwhile, rotations hide the cost of keeping numbers up. A combatant commander wants a certain presence line. The Navy delivers it by quietly robbing Peter to pay Paul. A destroyer crew slated for post-deployment reset is tapped to fill a gap because a sister ship missed its exit from the yard. A replenishment oiler borrows a detachment from another hull to keep a schedule. The brief reads, resourced. The ledger does not show the training debt you just booked or the maintenance you just kicked down the pier. Get this, off-book illusions start with good intentions. A planning cell adds latent capacity to surge charts, mothballed hulls that can be spun up in weeks, auxiliaries that can flex, civilian partners who can slot in. The timelines assume best case. Crews arrive complete, systems light off clean, and inspections pass on first attempt. In reality, reactivation drags because a certification inspector finds a crack in a boiler casing. The mariner pool can't fill billets without pulling from ships already at sea, and spare parts come from scavenging museum pieces or cutting new metal at boutique shops. What nobody knew at the time those assurances were inked is how fast the talent pipeline would thin. Steam licenses are rare because the commercial world moved on. The Ready Reserve Force needs steam engineers yesterday, but training one to stand a safe watch takes seasons, not days. So managers cross-deck the few they have. One ship gets underway, 2 others wait. The headline says activated. The fine print says limited. Human stories make the math hurt. A mariner stands on the catwalk of a 50-year-old hull, listening to a pump whine he hasn't heard since the 1990s. He knows it's not right. He also knows the test window closes at dusk, and the activation checklist wants a signature. He calls for a slow roll. The schedule groans. The phone rings in an office ashore where a staffer points to a slide promising readiness in 72 hours. The mariner signs off on, proceed with caution. The caution turns into a cold iron casualty 2 miles from the pier. Meanwhile, policymakers cite ship counts that fold these reserve hulls into deterrence math. On television, the number looks big. In operations, the number shrinks when you filter for ships that can sail, load, and deliver on the dates that matter. Sea trials across the Ready Reserve Force reveal material readiness gaps that push activation timelines far beyond slides. Crews get pulled from one hull to crew another. Training debt expands. The unit that gives up people keeps its name on the roster, but its real readiness drops to amber. NAVPLAN's red and amber bands sit like footnotes few want to read out loud. They warn about capacity limits, workforce shortfalls, and timelines that refuse to compress. Every time a plan leans on illusions, mothballs counted as minutes, rotations masked as resilience, deterrence messaging softens. Allies can smell it. Adversaries can calendar it. Here's the turn. Appear strong, therefore become brittle. A fleet that overstates what it can surge teaches the world to discount its promises. The fix starts with stripping the illusions from the ledger. Count only what can sail on the clock you own, price the crews you actually have, and treat the Ready Reserve Force like the antique collection it is until recapitalization lands brutal transparency and rebuilt plumbing. We've stared at the ghosts long enough. Now comes the price of honesty. The fixes aren't clever. They're uncomfortable, slow, and public. And they start with this rule: one truth. Not 4 screens, not 3 systems stitched with hope. One enterprise resource planning that carries maintenance, inventory, finance, and operations in the same language, with the same clock, under audit. Here's what that looks like in a room. A commander opens a dashboard that doesn't show colors first, it shows chains. A valve on a destroyer isn't green. It's a record, requirement to contract to obligation to receipt to installation, tied to a serialized part and a time-stamped image. If one link is late or missing, the tile does not smooth. It flags. You don't brief around it. You fix it, or you shift the schedule and accept it in writing where everyone can see. Action starts at the loading dock. Audit-grade inventory means handhelds that scan more than barcodes. They validate serials, lot numbers, shelf life, and condition codes against a master that lives in the enterprise resource planning, not a local spreadsheet. If the handheld's offline, it queues, then posts with full fields when it reconnects. No receipt, no obligation close. No image, no receipt. You break the habit of "we'll upload later" with controls that don't give you a later. Now munitions. Serialized tracking can't live in 3-walled gardens and hope finance catches up. Every weapon gets a single digital birth certificate that rides from depot to magazine to ship to shot or shelf life end. Lot extensions log to the item, not a folder. When a planner builds a strike, the system answers the only question that matters: which tail numbers are shootable on which day at which place. If the answer is pending, it does not count. Pending becomes a red line, not a footnote. Fuel gets the same treatment. Reconciliation moves from weeks to hours. Port receipts post electronically with full fields mapped to the right appropriation and fiscal year by default, not by a clerk's guess. Tank levels push telemetry to the enterprise resource planning, and burn models pull live ops tempo and sea state, not last quarter's curve. When a receipt's late, the model doesn't glide. It hard stops the forecast and forces a decision: slow, divert, or refuel early. The ledger stops lying to the bridge. Meanwhile, kill the shadow software. Legacy interfaces that drop fields or mistranslate codes get sunset on fixed dates, not migrate as feasible. Hard cutovers with rehearsals and rollback plans. Every system that touches readiness has to prove it writes a clean audit trail end to end. If it doesn't, it gets turned off and its function gets absorbed by the enterprise stack. You don't patch the maze, you bulldoze it. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Careers meet controls. Tie promotions and command selection to audit outcomes you can't stage. If a unit closes a quarter with unsupported journal voucher adjustments above a set threshold, someone explains on paper why operations demanded it and what changed before the next close. Protect truth-tellers who flag gaps. Make whistleblowing unnecessary by rewarding candor. A red slide becomes a sign of leadership, not failure, when it lands with a fix and a timestamp. In NAVPLAN year 2024 and year 2025, red and amber bands become contracts, not cautions. You say out loud, these docks, these artisans, this many certified welders, this many dry dock days, no more. Then you align money to the physics. You fund capacity where physics says you're short. New docks, new tooling, apprenticeship pipelines that feed level 2 and level 3 inspectors. And you stop pretending timelines compress because a slide wants them to. Now the ready reserve force. Sunset the logistics bet on steam plants you can't man. Targeted recapitalization replaces antiques with modern hulls you can crew from today's mariner pool. Until the steel floats, you publish activation timelines that match reality. Days to light off with named billets filled, parts sourced, and sea trials scheduled with margin. No more folding mothballs into surge promises. If a ship can't sail on the date you brief, it doesn't count. Human mechanics hold it together. Build a cross-rating cadre of ledger sailors, embedded at the deck plate, operators trained in maintenance, supply, and finance flows who can spot a bad code before it propagates. Give them authority to halt a closeout that hides risk. Give them cover when they do it on a Friday at 5 p.m. and put their names on fitreps when their no saves a deployment from a paper cliff. Culture bends by ritual. Weekly readiness boards show 3 things: what changed on steel, what posted in the system, and where the two disagree. Disagreements trigger actions, not narratives. If the fix needs a voucher, the voucher requires source proof attached at creation, not in a later sprint. You burn off the old scar tissue by making clean chains the path of least resistance. Admit weakness now, therefore regain power later. Short term this hurts, deployments slip, green boxes turn honest amber, but the line shifts from theater to truth, and as the fixes take, the noise drops. Plans match parts, fuel math matches Cs, munitions counts match racks. You get back the only deterrence that matters, dates you can hit with ships that actually sail. The stress test, a 30-day Pacific flashpoint. Day 1 began with a headline and a map. A fishing trawler collision near a disputed reef spiraled into a sovereignty standoff. A rival Coast Guard declared an exclusion zone. Local media showed cutters shoving smaller boats off lines. Washington told Indo-Pacific Command, hold the line without lighting the fuse. Surge orders moved at dawn. The calendar started its test. Here are the stakes in one breath. Can today's Navy surge on the ledges it has, not the slides it wants? The plan called for a carrier strike group to push west inside 5 days, backed by 2 destroyers from a different hub, plus a submarine already out. Logistics marked refueling tracks, munitions loads, and flight deck workups. The dashboard glowed ready. The decks braced for truth. Action cut fast to fuel. The oiler slated for day 3 hit a maintenance snag. An actuator flagged on a pre-sale check. The part existed in system, not on the pier. A workaround sent a different oiler from farther out, adding a day and chewing margin that air wing trainers had counted on. The burn model tried to glide with last quarter's plug. Ops killed the glide. They slowed, then slid one event right. The green tile dimmed to amber on a local screen. The Enterprise view hadn't caught up. Meanwhile, munitions math pulled a thread. The strike plan required a specific mix of anti-ship and air defense missiles by serial and shelf life. The magazine showed counts that matched the model. The chief's notebook didn't. 2 lots were within days of expiration and needed sign-offs. The inspection team was clearing a different site. The fix came by helicopter at dusk, inspectors strapped in with clipboards and a portable seal kit. They cleared one lot, condemned another, and forced a last-minute loadout swap. The slide stayed green. The plan got thinner. Get this, availability cliffs arrived dressed as calendars. A destroyer meant to join as Escort 2 hit an unexpected vibration during high-speed trials. A bearing late from a vendor had been installed just in time. The install held at pier speeds, not at sprint. The ship limped back into reduced operations. A sister hull across the coast took its place, but that swap pulled crew rest out of a tight cycle. The waiver stack grew. The clock did not care. What nobody knew at the time was how many available items lived inside systems that disagreed by inches. A pump receipt posted with a fund site mismatch, so finance couldn't clear the obligation. Inventory thought the bin had 1 spare. The maintenance system thought it was already issued. 2 screens argued as the bridge waited. A chief solved it the way chiefs do. He found the part, signed a pen and ink, and told the storekeeper to fix the fields later. Later was now a liability. Day 10 brought the first hard move. The rival Coast Guard surged cutters into the exclusion zone, flanked by maritime militia. A US destroyer made presence, loud hailers on, cameras rolling. The rival added drones. The drones hovered near refueling tracks like curious birds. Air wing planners scrubbed launch windows against fuel math and sea state. A delay of 90 minutes cascaded into a slip on a training event you cannot fake, the one that stamps the air wing fully certified for combat sorties. The commander accepted to be completed at sea. The sea kept its own counsel. Meanwhile, allies watched the clock. A regional partner offered a pier and a tanker slot if the strike group could hit a date certain. The strike group believed it could if the second oiler met the rendezvous and the magazine load swap held. The oiler arrived 2 hours late in crosswinds. The crane rotation stuttered on a software hiccup the port had patched last quarter. A reboot ate 30 minutes. The pallet shift finished after sunset. A sortie slid to dawn. The partners' parliament debated on television whether the plan was too tight to trust. Human moments kept the stress test honest. A supply officer traced a missing serial for a mission computer card across 3 systems. found it trapped behind a bad routing code, and called a clerk she'd never met at a base she'd never seen. The clerk walked to a cage, opened a bin, and read the number over a phone. The card flew by midnight. The receipt posted with a scanned image that finally matched finance's fields. One line of fog burned off. Then came the curveball. Cyber teams flagged anomalies at a regional port handling replenishment pallets. A scheduling tool spat duplicates. Cranes stood idle while supervisors resolved conflicts. On the ledger, it looked like overtime. On deck, it was a slip that ate the morning calm window. The air wing launched into heavier chop, cut one cycle, and carried risk forward. The commander briefed up the chain, green with caveats. Caveats don't show on maps. By day 20, the rival started timing boardings of illegal fishing boats to our fuel cycles. Each response burned hours and attention. The submarine held station, then edged wider to preserve stealth as surface coverage fluctuated. Drones reappeared when the tanker tracks lit. They vanished when the wake patterns suggested empty decks. Someone on the other side was reading our rhythm the way we had feared. What nobody knew at the time was how close the ledger came to breaking the old habit. A munitions lot flagged, pending validation, refused to count in the new rules imposed for the surge. That pending line forced a plan swap early, not late. It hurt on day 8. It saved day 24 when the rival baited a response the original mix would not have covered. One clean constraint rescued a promise. Day 30 ended without a shot, with tired crews and a calendar that almost cracked. Delayed arrivals, thin margins, allies asking harder questions. The stress test didn't fail. It exposed the bill. Now the leaders in the room had to choose. Preserve face with green slides, or admit the fixes have to land before the next map lights up. Meaning what the $21 trillion signal really says. Here's the meaning stripped to steel. The $21 trillion headline isn't a missing treasure. It's a yardstick of fragility built from unsupported journal voucher adjustments, entries used to force accounts to balance without sufficient documentation. Economist Dr. Mark Skidmore tallied those adjustments, reported across the Department of Defense and the Department of Housing and Urban Development from the year 1998 through the year 2015, into that staggering figure. Not proof of theft, proof of opacity at industrial scale. Why does opacity matter? Because war runs on clocks and chains, requirements to contracts to obligations to receipts to bolts in hands. When that chain goes opaque, leaders brief fiction without meaning to. A green tile hides a missing receipt. A balanced account hides a part that never shipped. A model hides a burn rate the sea will not honor. The $21 trillion total is the visible smoke from a quiet fire. Systems, incentives, and habits that trained an enterprise to smooth instead of verify. Now layer that on what we just stress-tested. In the flashpoint, a single pending validation line forced a plan swap early, and that early pain paid off when timing turned hostile. That's the lesson. Truth on the ledger isn't paperwork pride, it's combat margin. When unsupported adjustments vanish because you refuse to count what you can't prove, the plan gets leaner and harder, and your promises stop slipping to the right. There's irony here. For years, unsupported vouchers protected operations from bureaucratic delay. Leaders could move, ships could sail, but protecting speed with paper bred a deeper drag, compounding illusions that sapped trust. Allies read the slips. Adversaries read the patterns. Sailors lived the gap between screen and steel. The $21 trillion signal tells you how wide that gap became, one voucher at a time. So what does the number demand? Brutal transparency, not theater. One truth across maintenance, inventory, finance, and operations. Chains visible, timestamps real, serials tied to places, not promises. It demands culture that treats red as a tool, not a scarlet letter. Promotions that prize verification over vibe, and audits that land in weeks, not in remediation sprints nobody reads. It also demands adult arithmetic about capacity. Year 2024 and year 2025, NAVPLAN warnings aren't mood music. They're physics, docks, artisans, inspectors, dry dock days. The ledger has to mirror those hard limits so plans stop borrowing time they can't repay. If a dock is full, A slider doesn't create a berth. If a welder is booked, a bullet point doesn't lay a bead. And Sealift, the ready reserve force, has to be counted for what it is, not what we wish. Steam-powered roll-on, roll-off vessels dating to the 1970s are heritage, not hedge. Until recapitalization puts modern hulls under crews we actually have, activation timelines must be printed like tide tables and briefed like weather. Humbling, unspinnable, respected. Get this, the stakes aren't just ships, they're promises. Deterrence is a promise to be somewhere, on time, with the kit that matters. You keep it with clean books linked to clean bolts. You break it with green slides resting on unsupported chains. The $21 trillion figure is a scoreboard of how often we chose the latter. The fix is less clever than we'd like and more human than we admit. Reward candor, protect the people who say, not yet. Wire system so lies can't sneak in, and buy capacity where physics says you're short. Meaning, in one breath, the number quantifies decades of deferred integrity. It warns that a fleet can drift into myth when ledgers stop tracing to parts, fuel, and trained hands. Reverse that drift and the paper ocean drains. Plans shrink to what's real. Dates hold. Rivals hit fog, not gaps. And sailors stop living two truths. Chase optics, therefore lose wars. Chase truth, therefore win time. Time buys training. Training buys readiness. Readiness buys deterrence. That's the chain worth funding, defending, and auditing in daylight. The most dangerous fleet is China's. It's the paper fleet we keep pretending is afloat while the steel waits for proof. If you want the audit trail behind modern war, subscribe now. Next, watch our deep dive on how maintenance backlogs quietly neutralized submarines for a decade. New episodes expose the hidden plumbing of power, so you're never fooled by a green dashboard again.